Imagine you're trapped in a burning building. Smoke fills your lungs. The heat is unbearable and your vision is fading. In that moment, would you rather be saved by a kind neighbor who smiles warmly but has never held a fire hose, or by a gruff, unfriendly firefighter with 20 years of hands-on experience? It's not even a question. When your life is on the line, competence becomes the only virtue that matters. This isn't just about survival in emergencies. It's about how we choose the people who lead us, the ones whose decisions shape entire societies. And yet in politics, business, and even local governance, we repeatedly place our trust in well-meaning amateurs over skilled professionals simply because they make us feel good. We confuse warmth for wisdom, likability for leadership. This confusion has consequences. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans. More than 1,800 lives were lost. Damages exceeded $125 billion. But the storm wasn't the only disaster. The deeper catastrophe was leadership failure. FEMA director Michael Brown, appointed, despite minimal experience in disaster management, froze. Resources were mismanaged, responses delayed, lives abandoned. Brown wasn't evil. He wasn't malicious. He simply wasn't capable. And that is exactly the point. Well-intentioned incompetence kills not through cruelty, but through inaction, indecision, and a tragic mismatch between responsibility and readiness. Niccolo Machiavelli, writing 500 years ago, understood this uncomfortable truth in The Prince. He warned that a leader's primary obligation is to govern effectively, not to be admired, not to be morally pure, but to produce results. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both, he wrote. Not because fear is noble, but because effectiveness is non-negotiable. A competent leader who makes hard, even unpopular decisions may protect the nation. An incompetent one who smiles and means well may lead it into ruin. We must stop judging leaders by how they make us feel and start judging them by what they can actually do. Emotions don't fix infrastructure. Charisma doesn't manage pandemics. Intentions don't stop wars. Skill does, experience does. Systems collapse, not because villains take power, but because amateurs do, armed with good intentions and no idea what they're doing. In a world facing complex threats, climate change, global instability, AI disruption, competence is no longer a luxury. It's survival. And if we don't change how we choose our leaders, we'll keep burning down the future with the best of intentions. For centuries, we've been drawn to leaders who appear kind of moral and inspiring. We want to believe that good people create good outcomes, that moral character guarantees competent leadership. But Niccolo Machiavelli, writing in the ruthless political climate of Renaissance Italy, shattered that illusion. In his masterwork, The Prince, he made a brutally honest argument: a leader's first and most sacred duty is not to be good, it is to be effective. In his words, it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. At first glance, that line offends modern sensibilities. But Machiavelli wasn't glorifying tyranny. He was warning us about the cost of placing morality above results. He had seen firsthand how rulers who tried to appear virtuous were crushed by more strategic adversaries. Incompetent, but good princes lost cities. Weak but kind rulers caused famines. He argued that power is not a place for performance, it is a place for outcomes. Because while good intentions may soothe our conscience, they do nothing to protect our people when disaster strikes. The truth, Machiavelli understood, and one that remains painfully relevant today, is that ineffectiveness is a deeper betrayal than ruthlessness. When a leader's incompetence leads to widespread harm, their goodness becomes irrelevant. History remembers not what they meant to do, but what they failed to prevent. And when the stakes are survival, economic, military, environmental, the road to collapse is often paved with moral speeches and symbolic gestures. A leader who cannot govern, no matter how well-meaning, is a danger disguised as hope. This is why Machiavelli believed that governance must be judged by consequences, not intentions. The phrase, "the end justifies the means," is often misunderstood. Machiavelli wasn't saying that any evil is permissible if the outcome is good. He was saying that results are what matter most, especially when lives, nations, and futures are at stake. That leaders must often make difficult, even unpopular decisions to ensure stability and progress. A noble heart without a capable hand is not leadership, it is a liability. Today, we still fall into the trap he described. We vote for smiles. We promote charisma. We trust people who say the right things even when they've proven they can't deliver. But in a world of accelerating complexity, from climate crisis to global health, Machiavelli's core principle rings louder than ever. Leadership is not a moral identity, it's a functional responsibility. And those who cannot lead well, no matter how well-intentioned, have no business holding the power to decide others' fate. When we imagine history's villains, we picture tyrants, cold, calculating figures who deliberately inflict suffering. It's easy to fear evil, it's easy to condemn it, but the truth that history quietly whispers is far more disturbing. Many of the world's greatest disasters weren't caused by evil at all. They were caused by people who meant well, but lacked the competence to lead. This reality is more terrifying because it's far harder to recognize and even harder to stop. You can see evil coming. You can prepare for it, but well-meaning incompetence hides in plain sight, dressed in sincerity, shielded by good intentions. Consider the fall of the Roman Empire, not simply the result of foreign invasion, but of internal decay. The Emperor Honorius, remembered by historians not as cruel, but as catastrophically unfit, presided over one of the most important collapses in Western history. He was surrounded by advisors who lacked vision and capacity, who dismissed critical threats and mismanaged the empire's resources. As historian Edward Gibbon observed, the empire fell not because of malevolent enemies, but because those entrusted to protect it failed to rise to the occasion. The pattern repeats across time. In Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe's initial goals were noble, correcting colonial injustices and empowering black citizens. But the implementation of his land reform policies, driven by political urgency and lacking economic foresight, led to one of the worst hyperinflation crises of the modern era. Crops failed. Food vanished. A once prosperous economy collapsed. Mugabe's legacy wasn't written in cruelty. It was written in mismanagement and denial. And then there's Hurricane Katrina, where the tragedy wasn't the storm itself, but the gross failure of leadership in the aftermath. FEMA's director, Michael Brown, had no significant experience in emergency management. As people drowned in their homes, resources remained idle and lives were lost, not due to evil intent, but because a man who wasn't ready for the job was in charge of saving lives. This is the hidden danger of incompetence. It rarely looks dangerous until it's too late. It wears a friendly face. It speaks in noble language, but it crumbles under pressure and takes thousands, sometimes millions down with it. Evil is dramatic. Incompetence is subtle, yet time and time again, it's the smiling amateur, not the tyrant, who inadvertently sets entire civilizations on fire. And that's why the most dangerous phrase in leadership might not be, "I intend to harm, but trust me." I mean well. One of the most unsettling realities about leadership is this: those least qualified are often the most eager to lead. It's not a coincidence. It's a documented cognitive bias known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, a psychological phenomenon in which people who lack competence in a particular domain dramatically overestimate their abilities. The more someone doesn't know, the more confident they often are. It's a cruel paradox. Real experts tend to doubt themselves because they understand the complexity of the task, while novices blissfully unaware of what they don't know step forward with dangerous certainty. And in the realm of leadership, that misplaced confidence becomes a social hazard. Research from Kruger and Dunning, later expanded by Anderson and colleagues, found that individuals with the least expertise were significantly more likely to seek leadership roles, especially in group settings. They didn't do this maliciously. They genuinely believed they were capable. But belief and ability aren't the same. When this bias plays out at the level of government, corporate management, or institutional power, it can be catastrophic. What makes the Dunning-Kruger effect so damaging is that incompetent leaders don't know they're incompetent. And worse, they often reject competent people because those individuals threaten their inflated self-image. Instead of surrounding themselves with capable advisors who challenge their thinking, they build echo chambers filled with loyalists, people who reinforce their delusions and protect their egos. And once that dynamic sets in, it becomes almost impossible to reverse. The blind start leading the blind. Niccolo Machiavelli warned against this 500 years ago. He wrote that a ruler's intelligence is best judged by the quality of the people they keep around them. A great leader, he said, must be a patient hearer of truth. But truth is often uncomfortable. It reveals weakness. It demands growth. Insecure leaders avoid it, and that avoidance, driven by ego and fueled by illusion, spreads dysfunction across entire systems. This is why some of the worst leadership disasters don't begin with bad motives, but with unearned confidence. When someone believes their ambition qualifies them, when they assume that sincerity is a substitute for skill, they step into power with a blindfold and no plan. And as history shows, the cost is rarely paid by them. It's paid by everyone under their authority. If we continue to confuse confidence with competence, to equate loudness with leadership, we'll keep elevating people who are certain of everything and qualified for nothing. And in doing so, we won't just be enabling failure. We'll be institutionalizing it. One of the most deceptive illusions in modern leadership is the halo effect, our unconscious tendency to assume that if someone looks confident, sounds competent, or seems morally upright, they must also be effective. It's a shortcut our brains take to simplify complex judgments. But in the realm of leadership, this bias becomes dangerous because we're not choosing leaders based on data. We're often choosing them based on how they make us feel. And feelings, while powerful, are not facts. Groundbreaking research from Princeton psychologist Alexander Todorov revealed something chilling when participants were shown photos of political candidates for just a fraction of a second. They could predict election outcomes with roughly 70% accuracy, based solely on facial appearance. Not policy, not performance, just a face. What's even more disturbing is that follow-up research showed no real correlation between perceived competence and actual leadership ability. We are in effect choosing the people who look the part, not the ones who can actually play the part. This visual bias is further compounded by our cultural obsession with charisma. We trust those who are charming, articulate, and likable, even when they lack the expertise to solve real problems. We think kindness equals capability. That trustworthiness means technical skill, but as history and psychology have proven, these traits are often independent. A leader can be moral and incompetent. A speaker can be persuasive but unqualified. And when we prioritize style over substance, we end up elevating illusions over impact. Machiavelli saw this centuries ago. He wrote, "Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand. For everyone can see, but few can touch." He understood that appearances would always seduce the masses, and that effective rulers had to navigate this reality strategically. But today, rather than recognizing this bias, we embrace it. We let it guide our votes, our hiring decisions, our promotions. And then we're shocked when the leaders we trusted can't perform when it matters most. This isn't just a flaw in judgment, it's a systemic vulnerability. Incompetent leaders often rise not because they deceived us, but because we deceived ourselves. We mistook presence for preparation, smiles for strategy. And in doing so, we set ourselves up for disappointment and decline. The halo effect doesn't just cloud our vision, it blinds us to the damage that incompetence can do behind a friendly face. To protect the future, we must learn to look past the surface, because real leadership isn't about appearances, it's about outcomes. We live in an age obsessed with charisma in politics. Business, media, and even everyday workplace culture, we gravitate toward those who can command a room, speak with charm, and make us feel inspired. But beneath this cultural worship of confidence lies a dangerous truth. Charisma is not competence. The ability to speak well, to appear confident, to connect emotionally with an audience is not the same as the ability to solve problems, build systems, or govern effectively. Yet in leadership selection, especially in America, we routinely mistake one for the other. Research by organizational psychologist Tomas Chamorro-Premuzic reveals that charismatic individuals are significantly more likely to be hired into leadership positions, even when their track record shows no correlation with actual performance. In corporate environments, this bias is especially pronounced. Boards and hiring managers drawn to magnetic personalities often overlook more competent but less flashy candidates. They don't intend to make bad decisions, but in valuing presence over substance, they invite disappointment at scale. This isn't just theory, the data bears it out. PricewaterhouseCoopers PwC conducted an annual CEO success study analyzing thousands of leadership transitions over the past decade. They found that externally hired CEOs, those often chosen for their public appeal and perceived energy, were 30% more likely to be fired within 3 years than internally promoted candidates. The reason? While external hires often look the part, internal candidates tend to actually know the part. They understand the culture, the complexity, the people. They're often less charismatic, but far more competent. And yet we continue to be seduced by personality. We elect politicians who speak well on camera, but can't govern in crisis. We promote managers who are well-liked in meetings, but crumble under pressure. Why? Because charisma makes us feel safe. It soothes our uncertainty. It gives the illusion of control in a chaotic world. But illusions don't build bridges. They don't pass budgets. They don't avert disasters. Competence does. Machiavelli warned us about this centuries ago. He understood that the public judges leaders, not by the depth of their governance, but by how they appear to rule. Men judge more by the eye than by the hand, he wrote. In modern terms, we vote for the person who looks like a leader, not the one who leads like one. And it's costing us economically, politically, and morally. Charisma isn't inherently bad. In the right hands, it can amplify impact. It can inspire, rally, and unify. But without the foundation of competence, charisma is just theater. It may sell the vision, but it can't build the structure. And when we reward showmanship over skill, we don't just fail to solve problems, we make them worse. We elevate the wrong people, we demoralize the right ones, and we send a clear message to future generations. Looking good matters more than doing good. If we want to reverse this trend, we must retrain our instincts, learn to question charm, Ask for proof over presence. Seek out those who lead not with their image, but with their impact. Because in a world overflowing with noise and illusion, true leadership doesn't shout, it performs. We've been taught since childhood to value good intentions. It's the thought that counts. We assume that as long as someone means well, their mistakes can be forgiven. But when it comes to leadership, when the stakes involve lives, economies, and entire nations, good intentions are not enough. In fact, history shows that some of the worst catastrophes ever committed were not the result of evil men trying to destroy the world, but of sincere leaders trying to save it without the competence to do so. This is the paradox. We rarely confront the most catastrophic decisions often come from people who are convinced of their own righteousness. They act with moral certainty. They frame their policies in terms of justice, fairness, or progress. But in doing so, they often shut down dissent. They reject feedback. They create an environment where criticism is seen not as a contribution, but as betrayal. And in that moral echo chamber, disaster unfolds quietly, dressed in virtue. Philosopher Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil. How ordinary people can participate in horrific outcomes, not because they are monsters, but because they're thoughtless. But there is a parallel concept just as powerful, the catastrophe of good intentions. The idea that well-meaning leaders, when blinded by their belief in their own virtue, can do more harm than any cold-blooded villain. We've seen this throughout modern history, during China's Great Leap Forward. Mao Zedong genuinely believed his radical agricultural reforms would feed the masses. Instead, they triggered a famine that killed an estimated 30 million people in India. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's demonetization policy in 2016 was launched as an anti-corruption measure. The intention: fight black money, the outcome. Massive economic disruption, widespread hardship, and a blow to the country's poorest. These weren't acts of cruelty. They were acts of conviction. Conviction without competence. And the psychology behind this pattern is well documented. Researchers have identified a phenomenon called moral licensing, when people who view themselves as ethical feel unconsciously entitled to take riskier or more questionable actions. When a leader believes they are doing the right thing, they often override safeguards. They bypass experts. They silence objections, not because they're authoritarian, but because they're sure they're right. This moral armor makes them deaf to reality, and in leadership, deafness can be fatal. Machiavelli understood this danger long before modern psychology gave it a name. He believed governance must be judged not by what leaders intend, but by what their decisions produce. In his words, in the actions of all men, the end justifies the means. He wasn't advocating cruelty, he was demanding accountability, because in politics, the cost of failure isn't theoretical, it's human. So we must ask ourselves a difficult question. Are we evaluating leaders based on their ability to make moral declarations or on their ability to get results without causing collateral damage? Are we following the person who makes us feel hopeful, or the one who has the skills to actually deliver on that hope? The road to disaster is often paved with sincerity, but in a world that demands clear thinking and competent action, goodness without wisdom is a threat, not a virtue. If we continue to reward intention over outcome, we won't just repeat history, we'll prolong its tragedies. History is not short on leaders who meant well and yet left trails of devastation in their wake. Their policies were born from conviction, framed in moral language, and often applauded at first. But behind the applause came the aftermath: famine, economic collapse, human suffering. These are not cautionary tales of evil. They are sobering reminders of what happens when good intentions are wielded without competence. Take the Great Leap Forward in China. Mao Zedong envisioned a bold transformation: turn China into a global industrial power, eradicate poverty, and reform agriculture. But he ignored experts, rejected dissent, and implemented policies based on ideology rather than evidence. Communal farming to steal production, quotas, and flawed reporting systems led to widespread crop failure, the result. One of the worst famines in recorded history. Over 30 million people died, not because their leader was cruel, but because he was convinced he was right. A similar story unfolded in India in 2016. Prime Minister Narendra Modi launched a demonetization policy overnight, removing large currency notes from circulation to combat corruption and black market money. The motive was righteous, but the execution was chaotic. Businesses crumbled daily. Wage workers lost their incomes in millions, stood in lines for hours just to access their savings. The poor suffered the most. Economic activity stalled. Despite the moral rhetoric, the damage was measurable and widespread. And once again, the fallout was not due to malevolence, but miscalculation. Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe also began with noble aims. His land redistribution policies were designed to correct colonial injustices. But instead of organized reform, the execution was abrupt and politically driven. Productive farmland was seized from experienced agricultural workers and handed over without proper planning or support. The result? Hyperinflation, food shortages, and the collapse of what was once called the breadbasket of Africa. Mugabe's failure wasn't in his goal. It was in how unprepared he was to achieve it. These case studies reveal a chilling truth. Intentions do not prevent disaster. Execution does. The leaders in each of these stories were not monsters. They were visionaries who lacked the operational capacity to deliver on their dreams. Their failures weren't rooted in cruelty, but in a fatal blend of moral confidence and practical blindness. And that is what makes them so dangerous. Evil can be identified and opposed. But well-meaning incompetence, it's harder to detect, harder to criticize, and far harder to stop before it spirals out of control. Because when a leader believes they are doing the right thing, they rarely pause long enough to ask whether they're doing it well. One of the most subtle and dangerous psychological traps in leadership is moral licensing. The unconscious belief that once you've proven yourself to be good, you are now permitted to take actions that would otherwise be questioned. It's a mental loophole, a quiet form of self-justification that tells a leader, because I don't need to be questioned. And when power and morality combine without self-awareness, the consequences can be devastating. Psychologist Daniel Effron and others have documented how individuals who affirm their own morality through past actions, public gestures, or ideological alignment tend to become less concerned with the ethical weight of their future decisions. In other words, when people see themselves as the good guys, they stop checking their blind spots. And in leadership, where decisions affect millions, this blind spot isn't just a risk, it's a time bomb. Leaders who view themselves as moral crusaders often become less tolerant of dissent, more dismissive of warnings, and more reckless in execution. Why? Because they believe their intentions justify their actions. This is not Machiavellian calculation. It's emotional conviction, shielded by righteousness. It's a leader thinking, I don't need to listen. I already know I'm right, but governance is not a moral monologue. It is a complex system of checks, feedback, and adaptation. And when morality turns into certainty, feedback loops break. Expertise is ignored. Outcomes suffer. Take the example of Prime Minister Modi's demonetization policy in India. Many experts warned about implementation challenges, economic fallout, and the disproportionate harm to the poor. But because the policy was framed as a moral stand against corruption, criticism was viewed as obstruction. The moral framing became a political armor protecting flawed execution from scrutiny. And that's precisely how good intentions turn into bad policy. And bad policy turns into national pain. This is the emotional core of moral licensing. It shuts down doubt, not because the person is corrupt, but because they believe they're already on the right side of history. And this self-perception can become so strong that it overrides logic, evidence, and even compassion. When leaders see themselves as morally pure, they often begin dismantling the very safeguards that protect society from error, because they think those safeguards apply only to lesser people. Machiavelli, with his brutal clarity, understood the difference between intended virtue and operational competence. He believed that results must anchor righteousness, not the other way around. The end justifies the means, he wrote, not to endorse evil, but to demand that leaders prioritize outcomes over moral storytelling. In modern terms, you don't get credit for meaning well if your actions create chaos. And here's the emotional twist. We, the public, often enable this dynamic. We're more forgiving of incompetence wrapped in kindness than we are of tough decisions made by cold pragmatists. We excuse harm if we believe the person meant well. But this emotional bias does not erase consequences. It simply delays accountability until the damage becomes undeniable. So when evaluating leaders, the real question isn't, do they care? It's, do they know how to lead? Because moral conviction without strategic skill is not leadership. It's well-packaged recklessness. And in a world that desperately needs results, the most ethical thing a leader can do is know their limits or step aside for someone who doesn't need moral armor to make wise decisions. There is a strange asymmetry in how we react to failure. When we see someone commit an act of intentional harm, we rise up. We get angry. We mobilize. We demand justice. But when someone fails due to incompetence, even if the outcome is equally or more destructive, we hesitate. We sympathize. We excuse. And we often let it go. This phenomenon reveals one of the most dangerous blind spots in human psychology. Our collective tolerance for incompetence is far greater than for malice. Studies in moral psychology have repeatedly shown that people are more willing to forgive failures of ability than failures of character. A fascinating study by Feldman and colleagues found that individuals in workplace environments were willing to incur greater personal cost to avoid collaborating with someone they perceived as unethical than someone who was merely incompetent, even when the latter posed greater practical risk. We're wired to detect and defend against malice. but we're blind to the slow corrosion of well-intentioned failure. This creates a societal vulnerability. Malicious actors often trigger alarm bells. They provoke opposition, they generate resistance, but the incompetent, especially those who seem kind, sincere, or sympathetic, are given second chances. They're seen as unfortunate rather than unfit, and so their harm continues often unchecked because they mean well. We mistake their damage as accidental, not structural, but structural incompetence left unchallenged metastasizes. Niccolo Machiavelli understood this long before modern psychology gave it language. He observed that people are less concerned with offending one who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared. This isn't just a political insight, it's a psychological one. Leaders who are warm, relatable, or morally aligned with us are less likely to provoke scrutiny, even when their failures are catastrophic. Their personas insulate them. Their intentions become their shield even as their outcomes unravel the very institutions they lead. Consider how organizations respond to leadership failure. When a CEO commits fraud or is caught in scandal, the response is swift. Termination, public statements, policy overhauls. But when a leader fails due to incompetence, missed targets, poor judgment, failed strategies, the response is often tempered. More training, a reshuffling of duties. Another chance. The assumption is that with time, they'll improve. But what if the core issue isn't time but capability? This mindset is not limited to corporations. It applies to governments, school systems, even families. The danger is not just that incompetent leaders remain in power, but that they set a new standard of mediocrity. What once would have been unacceptable becomes normalized. Expectations drop, accountability fades, and slowly systems begin to decay. Not from corruption, but from chronic underperformance. What makes this so troubling is how deeply it connects to our emotional instincts. Criticizing someone who means well feels cruel. It feels like an attack on their character, and so we stay silent. We tolerate dysfunction. We label failures as unfortunate instead of preventable. But compassion without clarity is complicity, and when we allow incompetence to persist out of politeness or empathy, we become co-authors of its consequences. To move forward, we must recalibrate how we judge leadership. Not by intention, but by effectiveness. Not by how they make us feel, but by what they actually deliver, because the most dangerous leaders are not always the most malicious. They're the ones who fail with a smile and leave us too emotionally disarmed to call it what it is. Unacceptable. There's a quietly devastating truth behind many modern institutions. People often rise not because they're ready, but because they were good at their last job. This is the essence of the Peter Principle, first articulated by Lawrence J. Peter, which states that in hierarchical organizations, individuals tend to be promoted until they reach their level of incompetence. At first, they perform well. They're rewarded, they climb. But eventually, they're placed in a position that demands a different skill set, one they never developed. And there they remain, stuck, ineffective, and dragging down everything around them. This isn't just a theory. An in-depth study by Benson Lee and Shu analyzed data from over 200 companies and confirmed the pattern. High-performing employees were frequently promoted into management roles, even when those roles required completely different competencies. The result, productivity plummeted not only for the manager, but for the teams they led. The organization suffered not because of bad people, but because the system rewarded performance without evaluating leadership potential. What makes this phenomenon so dangerous is how easily it becomes the new normal. When incompetence is tolerated, expectations lower. Standards decay. Entire departments, agencies, even nations begin to function below their capacity. And over time, what once would have been recognized as failure becomes standard operating procedure. Incompetence isn't removed, it's accommodated. And systems designed for excellence settle for survival. Machiavelli would have found this deeply troubling. He believed leadership must evolve with the times that those who cannot adapt are not simply ineffective, but dangerous. Entrenched incompetence doesn't just prevent progress, it actively resists it. And in doing so, it locks institutions into cycles of failure, protected by layers of denial, bureaucracy, and misplaced loyalty. The cost isn't just inefficiency, it's erosion. The slow decay of competence, trust, and purpose, not from malice, but from mediocrity, mistakenly promoted into power. We no longer live in a world where simple problems have simple solutions. The modern era is defined by complexity networks of systems layered with interdependence, where one decision in one corner of the globe can ripple into economic collapse, climate disasters, or geopolitical shifts elsewhere, from artificial intelligence to global pandemics, from supply chain fragility to climate tipping points. We are surrounded by problems that require sophisticated, adaptive, and deeply competent leadership. And yet our systems continue to elevate leaders trained for yesterday's world leaders who rely on instinct, charisma, or ideology. instead of structured reasoning. Cross-domain fluency and evidence-based judgment, this gap between the complexity of the world and the capability of its leaders, has become an existential threat, not just an administrative problem. Researchers like Lish and Rivkin have shown that the complexity of government policy has risen dramatically over recent decades, with today's policies requiring far more interconnected decision-making coordination across multiple agencies and the ability to understand unintended consequences across economic, technological, and social systems. Yet the decision-makers responsible for navigating these systems are often unprepared, not out of bad intent, but because the skill set required has evolved faster than our standards for leadership have. It's no longer enough for a leader to be a good speaker or a loyal party member. In today's world, that's not leadership, it's theater. What we need are systems thinkers, people who can hold multiple variables in their minds, who can listen to competing truths without defaulting to ideology, and who can navigate the ambiguity of incomplete data with rational humility. The ability to say, I don't know, and then build a plan to find out is now more valuable than any moral grandstanding. Neuroscientist Ian Robertson has shown that as complexity increases, intuitive decision-making becomes less effective and structured, analytical approaches become essential. But many of our most prominent leaders rely on instinct and gut feeling. They govern not with frameworks, but with slogans. Not with humility, but with certainty. And in doing so, they become mismatched to the moment outdated operating systems in an upgraded world. Machiavelli understood even in his time that the winds of change do not wait for stagnant rulers. He spoke of fortuna, fortune as the unpredictable forces that shape history. And he argued that only those leaders who possess virtu, the practical intelligence to adapt, could hope to master it today. Those unpredictable forces are no longer mythological, they are statistical. They are ecological. They are technological, and they require more than good hearts. They require trained minds. When nations fail to close the competence gap between their leaders and the problems they face, the cost is not abstract. It is measured in economic downturns, in failed pandemic responses, in environmental collapse, and in public trust that once broken may never return. This is the new leadership crisis, not one of character, but of capacity. In this new world, the kindest person in the room might be the worst person to put in charge, and the most competent one may be overlooked because they lack polish. But if we want to survive the future, we must reverse that instinct. Because in an age of complexity, competence is not elitism, it is our last line of defense. Niccolo Machiavelli has long been misunderstood. His name, often invoked as a synonym for cold manipulation, masks a deeper and far more urgent message, especially for our time. What Machiavelli truly believed, and what the prince so forcefully argues, is that competence in leadership is not just a practical necessity. It is a moral duty. He called it virtu, not virtue, in the modern sense of being good or kind, but a type of strategic strength, practical intelligence, and decisive skill that allows a leader to navigate chaos and produce results. For Machiavelli, virtu was the counterbalance to fortuna, the unpredictable nature of the world. In our era filled with complexity, volatility, and high-stakes decision-making, this philosophy is more relevant than ever. Machiavelli wrote, "It is better to be impetuous than cautious. For fortune is a woman, and it is necessary if you wish to master her to conquer her by force." While the gendered metaphor may feel outdated, the point is timeless. Fortune favors the prepared, the capable, the bold, but only when their boldness is guided by skill. In Machiavelli's world, a weak leader with good intentions posed a greater threat to the state than a strong one with a questionable reputation. Why? Because failure caused by incompetence is still failure, no matter how kind the heart behind it. Modern psychological research supports this idea. A massive meta-analysis by judging colleagues reviewing dozens of studies on leadership effectiveness found that cognitive ability consistently predicted leadership success across industries and cultures. Charisma, extroversion, and moral signaling were not nearly as predictive. What mattered most? The ability to analyze, plan, adapt, and execute, in other words. Virtue lives on in science, in boardrooms, in politics. We just forgot to name it. Machiavelli also understood that true leadership isn't about popularity or idealism. It's about serving the long-term good of the people, even when that means making hard decisions. This is why he would likely admire leaders like Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew, often criticized for authoritarian tendencies, but undeniably successful in transforming a struggling nation into a thriving, stable, prosperous society. Was he loved by all? No, but was he effective? Unquestionably. Machiavelli would call that virtu in action. This challenges a deeply held assumption in American political and cultural life, that being good is the same as being fit to lead. But just as we would never allow a kind person with no medical training to perform surgery, we should not allow morally upright but ill-equipped individuals to govern nations, manage economies, or make life and death decisions. Intentions don't operate hospitals. Ideals don't execute crisis plans. People do, and those people must be competent. Ultimately, Machiavelli's philosophy doesn't reject ethics, it reframes them. It tells us that outcomes matter more than postures, that the highest moral act a leader can perform is to step aside when they lack the capability, or better yet, to build the skills necessary to truly lead. Competence in this sense is not elitism, it's responsibility. And in a world full of fragile systems and rising stakes, the most ethical question we can ask of any leader is simple. Can they actually do the job? Because in the end, as Machiavelli knew all too well, leadership is not about looking good, it's about protecting the people. We live in a time where appearances dominate judgment, where charisma is mistaken for leadership and moral posturing often replaces meaningful results. But the hard truth is this: intentions don't fix broken systems. Competence does, as Machiavelli argued centuries ago, and modern history has confirmed the greatest dangers to societies aren't always evil actors, they're well-meaning incompetents given power. They're not equipped to wield, and that danger is amplified when we, the public, choose leaders based on how they make us feel, rather than what they've proven they can do. So what can we do differently in life? In work and leadership, we must shift from emotional loyalty to outcome-based evaluation. Judge decisions by results, not rhetoric. Value expertise over enthusiasm. Be suspicious of those who seek power without demonstrating skill. And most importantly, hold yourself to the same standard, whether you're managing a team, raising a family, or building a business. Competence is not a luxury, it's your moral responsibility. It's easy to praise effort to excuse failure when it comes from a good place. But good intentions don't repair the damage left behind. In a complex, high-stakes world, we need more than kindness. We need clarity, accountability, and execution. Because the future doesn't belong to those who simply mean well. It belongs to those who know what they're doing and do it well.